is the point of political philosophy to develop an account of justice, a theory of justice, really an ideal theory of justice, that which really gets at justice essentially, universally. In Philosophy and Real Politics, Raymond Geuss develops an account of what's known as political realism, arguing against this more kind of dominant idealist strain in political philosophizing, which sees itself really as almost a kind of extension of applied ethics, talking about morality and the good as the basis of what political philosophy is interested in, just in things that involve, the state or issues of decision-making procedures. So this is the first part of 2 videos on this text. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on what he takes the kind of core nexus of political realism to be. So must political thinkers develop an ideal theory of justice in order to guide political actions? This is a basic claim that's made by ideal theorists like John Rawls, G.A. Cohen, or others, because they think that without a systematic or a universal account of justice, an ideal account, that which is abstracted away from the particularities that we might actually see politics involved in, without that, we're kind of aimless. We don't know what to do in our public policies. But Geuss rejects this notion. He offers 4 theses instead about political philosophy. First, he says political philosophy must be realist. Philosophers should try first to understand why real political actors behave the way they do. So they shouldn't think first, they shouldn't begin kind of in the clouds or abstracted away what ought political philosophers do, and then figure out how to get real political actors to do and act how they ought to. Instead, you work from the ground up. You see how actually, what do politicians do? What are they engaged in, right? So what is the kind of scope of politics that a philosophy of politics would be interested in? How then, of course, are certain concepts like the state, law, even justice, how are these actually used in real political life? Because that then would inform the extent to which we would want to think about not only whether a certain kind of rights or justice are correct, but to what extent they can be universal. So in this way then, as opposed to most ethicists who likely think that politics is merely just applied ethics, such that ethics is really going to focus on what the good is, what it means to be moral, and then how to behave morally. So normative ethics is going to offer certain normative principles, and then political philosophy is going to figure out how to implement those ethical principles in political life, or really how to arrange society such that people maybe can act out according to those moral principles. Geuss thinks that's not correct at all. That politics is not applied ethics. Politics is not essentially focused on the good, but in political spheres. It's something different. It's rooted in the real issues that concern political actors in real life. So the second thesis is that political philosophy must recognize that politics is in the first instance about actions and the context of actions, not about mere beliefs or propositions. That even theorizing actions themselves, trying to get, in a theory, as close to kind of ordinary processes in political life, is still abstracted away from what's really going on in this kind of base level of political concerns. So real political philosophers, if they're really interested in trying to contribute to political life, they ought to be interested in, well, why might someone be interested in justice in one context, or law in another context, or authority in then even different contexts, as opposed to, well, how do we think about what is a rational account of rights that then should be used in those political contexts? What is a rational account of justice? What's a rational account of law? Because politics doesn't operate according to whether someone's a concept of rights, or whether someone says you've wronged me, whether their claim is logically sound or not. Right? Politics deals with moments of action, moments of decision in dialogue, or often conflict, or even hostile, existential conflict. So if you're trying to develop a theory of political philosophy that is primarily based on beliefs or propositions, such that then those propositions should guide people in how they behave, that's not actually what occurs in real political life. So there's going to be a disconnect. Thirdly, politics then is historically located. As Geuss says, it has to do with humans interacting in institutional contexts that change over time, and the study of politics must reflect this fact. This is not an objection to generalizing. We don't even know what it would be like to think without generalizing. There are no interesting eternal questions of political philosophy. Such detached general statements do not wear their meaning on their sleeves. In fact, understanding politics means seeing that such statements have clear meaning at all only relative to their specific context. And this context is one of historically structured forms of action. So the issues of a right or justice, law, authority, justification, legitimacy, all these kinds of concepts in political philosophy, these have historical origins, and their meaning changes over time. And we should be sensitive to then the kind of context where certain accounts of rights or legitimacy cohere, in which they guide action. And fourth, politics is more like the exercise of a craft or art than like traditional conceptions of what happens when a theory is applied. What's interesting about this is it's almost kind of a hearkening back to, if you read, for example, Machiavelli, or even, Roman political philosophers, so then philosophers kind of in the Renaissance area as well. It's focused on, well, how can we inform, how can we best educate political actors to act wisely in a political domain, as opposed to political philosophy dealing with, well, what is a systematic conception of a state? What's a systematic conception of justice, of rights, and so on? Instead, because political realism is saying you have to begin from the real concrete instances of political life, you can't have a systematic theory that can account for all the kinds of flux in political life. Instead, you take into account all these different things from the kind of a certain distanced perspective that then you can help guide and inform real political actors to make wise decisions in light of thinking about all the particular problems that arise in political philosophy. So almost like, in a sense, political philosophers offer tools for decision-making, conceptual tools perhaps for decision-making, or guidance for political actors. So what Geuss does is he locates kind of the nexus of political realism within three questions that come from three thinkers. The first is this question, he says, that comes from Lenin. So he says, Geuss says, to think politically is to think about agency, power, and interests, and the relations among these things. That it's first and foremost about, well, what a person is bestowed a certain authority over others, legitimacy, power. How then does their role in society inform whether they have that legitimacy, and over whom then do they have that legitimacy or that authority? How does it relate among the different individuals in society? He takes this from this question that Lenin originally says politics is concerned with the question of whom, and Geuss rephrases as who does what to whom for whose benefit. He says, what this means in the first instance is that the impersonalized statements one might be inclined to make about human societies generally require, if they are to be politically informative, elaboration into statements about particular concrete people doing things to other people. So first and foremost, then, we can see politics as being concerned with what kinds of powers or benefits are bestowed on a certain people because of the position that they occupy within an overall kind of schema or division of labor, and how that then relates to others who have to perhaps obey or listen to those who have that authority over them. So it's not a question of what's the correct distribution of power, what's the correct distribution of rights, but how does the relations between people bestow certain individuals with certain rights or power over others. So it's primarily locating this concern with then the relations between people and the agents involved in those relations. So they're not fixed, right? It's always kind of particularized. It's always historical. It's always contextual. So why one individual in one context might have a certain power over others, let's say like a priest might have over political actors in, let's say, the Middle Ages in Italy, the priest is not going to have that same power over political actors, let's say, in Germany in the 21st century. And that's not because the priest just lacks power that they had before as a power of some object you possess, but it's because of the relation that now the kind of status a priest perhaps has in relation to the political official because of the kind of concerns or the larger background context of society, of economics, political, geopolitical interests. More than this, what we get from Lenin is this notion that it's not just that when political philosophy has a certain kind of theory of rights or justice that we have in the academy, philosophers debating over what theory is correct in terms of really just trying to get at the truth, but that every theory itself is partisan insofar as its methodology is political. That how you do political philosophy, what's deemed legitimate as a methodology to engage in, is as much informed by the political paradigm that theorizing is taking place, as much as any ideology is informed by its political paradigm as it's acted out and informs political actors within that context. So Geuss says, this means that any kind of comprehensive understanding of politics will also have to treat the politics of theorization, including the politics of whatever theory is itself at the given time being presented for scrutiny as a candidate for acceptance. Lenin locates this within the opposition of materialism and idealism. And so he says we can locate every theory on one of those two sides, and they're necessarily opposed to each other because of the kind of political actions or legitimacy they enable. And so when philosophers think they're just neutrally engaging in a pursuit for the truth as to what justice really is, or what freedom really is, what the law really is, they're actually engaging in an unconscious effort at either justifying or criticizing the certain dominant power structure. The second question comes from Nietzsche. So Geuss says that from Nietzsche we get this notion that politics is a matter of deferential choice, where we opt for A rather than B, but we don't opt for A because it is absolutely the right thing to do. It's that in the context we choose A because it brings about perhaps better consequences, or it retains legitimacy for a certain institution, whereas B might call that legitimacy into question. So he says, thus, politics is not about doing what is good or rational or beneficial simpliciter. It is not even obvious that that is an internally coherent thought at all, especially if all methodology is partisan, but about the pursuit of what is good in a particular concrete case by agents with limited powers and resources, where choice of one thing to pursue means failure to choose and pursue another. So we might find a political actor confronted with a difficult choice. Let's actually get out of politics for a second. I was watching the show house with my wife the other night, and there's this problem where they have a daughter and they have a son, this family, and basically the son has this kind of disease that's going to kill him in about, let's say, 10 years, and the son is, let's say, 15. So he's going to live to about 25. The daughter, she's perfectly healthy and everything, but and she's roughly the same age as the son. But she is, she's come down with a sickness, and they didn't know what the sickness was. So when they got a lung transplant, it turned out that the body didn't accept the lung, and so it was basically going to be impossible for her to get another lung transplant. The dilemma that the parents were faced with was whether then they would take a piece of their son's lung to save their daughter's life, who would die within like a day if she didn't get that lung. And what it would mean is then their daughter could live a healthy life, average lifespan, and so on, right? But their son's life, instead of living for another 10 years, he'd only really have like another 3 years to live. So does the parent in that situation choose to take a piece of their son's lung so their daughter can live a full life, taking away 7 years from their son? Now, this dilemma, if we're talking about ethics, it's potentially, depending on, of course, what ethical theory we're dealing with, but usually a kind of ideal theory of ethics is going to want to get at, well, what is just the absolutely morally correct situation? So is it going to overall increase happiness or decrease suffering? Is this taking advantage of someone, using them as a mere means as opposed to an end in themselves? But Geuss's point is going to be, look, so it's not that the parents opting to take that piece of lung from their son to benefit their daughter is necessarily the morally correct choice, in some ideal circumstance or whatever. It's just a matter of choice in that situation. It doesn't hold beyond it. It's just that for them, the son says, well, look, to the daughter eventually, you have kind of been living for me, doing things as if, I could live vicariously through you. And so I want to do this for you, right? It's not that it's necessarily right. It's that for their specific aims, they choose that option. And so we can extrapolate this to perhaps a political situation where a politician has to make a choice. They're confronted with two options, and they don't choose one of those options because it really is the correct choice to do, but in light of the circumstances, what are their aims? What are they ultimately pursuing, and what option allows them perhaps to achieve those aims, taking into account all the different kinds of risks and so on? But it doesn't mean ideally the option they choose, it is the best option. So what this means is that timing is important for political action, because an ability to pick the crucial moment when action can be successful is an important constituent of one of the skills a good politician exhibits. So we have in political life all this kinds of friction that occurs that politicians have to deal with, which involves deliberation among constituents and so on. Now, political life then is this kind of, it's immersed in the flux of life that, kind of Nietzsche talks about, which is why when you talk about, let's say, like any kind of a concept of the idea of a tree, for example, you're never really getting at the thing itself with that concept of the tree, because you have to necessarily take away the particularities of each to have a universal concept that can account for all trees. In political action then, right, politicians are making these particular decisions. You can't really have then a political concept that can be useful for politicians because it's not going to account for all those political decisions. This is why those concepts, though, can be useful, not as a prescription where you kind of like plug in, okay, well, here's the problems, what does the formula say I should do? This is why it takes education for a politician to be a good politician, to have that kind of skill in making those kinds of choices and opting for A rather than B. The third question comes from Max Weber. So for Weber, the essential topic of politics does not concern justice. It's about legitimacy. It's about whether a certain exercise of power is justified or not, whether it is legitimate, and what then determines legitimacy within a given context. Specifically, legitimacy always, in the end, results in the use of force, of violence, and whether or not then that ultimate use of violence is justified or not. And it's not to say that in politics, all kinds of decisions ultimately result in whether violence is going to be used or not. Because you could have a decision as to whether we're going to install a post office here or there. But what backs the conditions that make possible the discussion as to whether or not you're going to build a post office here or there takes place only in the context of a larger apparatus that has, for example, a monopoly on the use of force, and whether then that is justified or not. So as Geuss says, Weber's idea, of course, was not that politics was in every specific instance about, giving or objecting to a particular legitimizing argument for a particular act of violence, but rather that there was a generalized human order that claimed and had some kind of legitimacy. And part of that legitimacy was, in one or another of a variety of complex and indirect ways, transmitted down to the acts of violence that were perpetrated as a normal part of social interaction. So a more realistic understanding of what is at issue in politics in a wider variety of circumstances would connect it with attempts to provide legitimacy not simply for acts of violence, but for any kinds of collective action, such as deciding voluntarily to build a new road or change to a new unit of measurement. So what exactly does this mean for political philosophy? What are the kinds of tasks that political philosophy would be involved with? What are its aims? What does it do? Why have political philosophy at all? The first task that we might think political philosophy is interested in is understanding how systems work, describing them. Do we have an accurate representation of a state? Do we have an accurate representation of the law? The problem with this, though, Geuss says, is we don't really want to just describe them accurately, whether we have an accurate account of the state or not, or the law or not. We want to judge systems as to whether they are good or bad, better or worse, apparatus of government or systems of law. He says, we naturally compare one thing with another in the interests of finding out which is tastier, more pleasing to the eye, more useful, and so forth. In this respect, the study of politics is no different from most other human enterprises. We do not simply want to understand how the apartheid system worked in South Africa in the 1970s. We wish to judge it as being better or worse, in some respect, than other systems. There is no obvious single dimension along which we distinguish the good, the bad, the better, the worse, the best. One social system is more productive, another gives better subsidies to its symphony orchestras. A third has an especially perspicuous and flexible legal system. It is an assumption that there is always one single dimension for assessing persons and their actions that has canonical priority. So we can always say in one way one system is better because perhaps it does one thing that we want. But it's really only one thing that we want in light of certain issues we're interested in light of then a specific context. But we can't really judge a system systematically as to whether in all times and all places it is the best. Because in some cases it might make sense that we say this is the best system because of what it allows for, the subsidies it gives to symphony orchestras. But in another context, that might not make sense. So humans do not merely wish to understand and evaluate the world around them, though, Geuss says. It's not just then that we want to understand how systems work. It's not just that we want to judge whether one system is better or worse. But instead, we want to, he says, locate ourselves and their projects that the political projects we're engaged in some larger imaginative structure that makes sense to us, and to guide our actions to bring about what they would find to be satisfactory outcomes or to improve in some other way with the life that we or they live. So again, it's not just that we want to judge from kind of a third-person perspective, as political philosophy ideally wants to do in describing ideal justice, but it's also, does it make sense for us? Does it appeal to kind of our convictions? Does it allow us to live out our lives in certain ways that cohere with our belief systems, with our values? So here we're getting from the needing to judge certain systems that political philosophy might be engaged with, to connecting it to real particular individuals and how they see, in a sense, their life story playing out, whether it coheres with them in that way or not. And that's the difficult task of political theory, is the connecting of those two things, in a sense, the ideal and the non-ideal. Now, Geuss, though, doesn't think there is any such thing as ideal philosophy. It's all non-ideal. The fourth thing that political philosophy might be interested in is seeking to make a constructive contribution to politics through conceptual invention or innovation. And he doesn't mean just coming up with kind of maybe new words that we can use in our lexicon, replacing old ones, or new words that allow us to better describe things that we already use and think about. But instead, conceptual innovation, he says, has a strong normative component. It actually changes the possibilities for our political tasks. So he says, in interesting cases, like the concept of the state, introducing the concept requires one to get people not merely to use a certain word, but also to entertain a certain kind of theory, which has a strong normative component. You don't have the concept of the state unless you have the idea of a freestanding form of authority. And the idea of authority requires some appeal to notions like ought or should. You do not automatically have a state when some group of people, in fact, completely controls the use of violence within a territory. If you did, every group of successful kidnappers would constitute a state. Rather, a state exists only if enough people think they ought to obey the orders of some person or designated group of people in the right sense of ought. The sense of ought in question might be indeterminate in certain ways, but it must certainly go beyond the sense of ought implicit in saying, you ought to do what he says, meaning that since he is holding a gun to your head, it would be exceedingly inadvisable to fail to do what he requests. Characteristically, the concept the state is introduced together with a theory about the nature and the source of the authority which the abstract entity that is so named is supposed to have. In the early modern period, this was usually some version of the social contract theory. Of course, once the state actually gets established as a distinct and massive social reality that cannot be ignored, one can come to reflect that the purported sources of its authority are deficient, that the social contract theory is invalid, false, or confused. And one might even come to the conclusion that the state ought to have no real authority. To say this retrospectively, that is, to call an entity that was, in some sense, originally introduced by being defined as a locus of authority non-authoritative, is, under the circumstances, no more problematic than continuing to call Greenland, Greenland, even after one discovers that it is not, after all, or at any rate was not until the recent acceleration of global warming, very green. So when they were introduced, concepts like the state did not exactly mirror any fully pre-existing reality, because using these concepts represented as much an aspiration as a description. So political theories can have the function as well of not just inventing these new concepts, making possible new forms of action, new practices, but also of propounding and fostering, or even analyzing and thereby helping to dissolve ideologies. So ideologies, he says, can be thought of as a composite comprising three elements. First, a certain configuration of power, that an ideology might be what enables a theory of power to exist, or it might be how we think about that theory of power, such that, one theory of power is that power works kind of emanating as a pyramid from the king on down. And this works really well with a certain kind of like feudal order, where the lord is clearly the highest political figure. But that kind of a theory of power doesn't work really well with a more complex system, let's say in a modern liberal capitalist system, where you have such diffuse responsibility, you have this division of labor that really complicates and makes power work in a more nuanced way. And so the kind of ideology about how we think about a society working can change based on that configuration of power. Now, the second element is that this configuration of power brings it about that certain contingent, variable features of our human mode of existence, which are in fact maintained in existence only by the constant exercise of that power, appear to be universal, natural, or necessary or spontaneously arising features. So one kind of an ideology might have it that, well, that there is a patriarchal figure, that there is a monarch. This is a natural facet of society, and there's no doing away with it. Right now, that would be a certain kind of ideology that helps maintain that configuration of power. But another kind of ideology might say, no, all of that is socially constructed. No, monarch or patriarchal figure has any more right to ultimately be in charge and have that kind of authority or legitimacy than anyone else does in any other kind of a system. And so you might result in more kind of relativistic or even anarchistic conceptions of social arrangements. So it's not just that ideology results in describing a certain configuration of power, but it brings into about certain normative powers by those individuals within that configuration of power. And so thirdly, as a result of certain particular interests can plausibly present themselves as universal ones. And so this might be from the perspective that, for example, from a class perspective, if we're thinking about the proletariat, the interest of, for example, maybe raising the minimum wage, the power of collective bargaining, seeing that as your first and foremost political priority makes sense as a member of the proletariat, whereas maybe if you're a member of the bourgeoisie, lowering taxes makes sense, and that might be where your political priorities lie. And it's not necessarily that one of those priorities is universally or objectively correct as opposed to the other. It's about what perspective are you coming from, such that your ideological lens informs what you to see as your most important priority. And so we can see this, for example, in Marxism, and the idea that, well, of course, class conflict is essential for the working classes. So it's not that politics is a matter of achieving justice objectively. It's a matter of engaging in class conflict, for the sake of the proletariat, dissolving class antagonisms, but not in some objective sense, only in the sense of the movement of history through class conflict. So to what extent then this represents a kind of political realism can represent a theory of politics is up for debate, because Geuss doesn't necessarily want a comprehensive theory of politics, since it is wanting to get at what are the most particularist characteristics that we find in actual political life. And what he's done is tried to bring out what are the main things that a political philosophy should be interested in if it is going to proceed from the ground up, from real political life, and not from idealizing first and foremost.